Welcome back, my friends, to the sweet spot where IT leaders share their insights with other IT leaders and others that want to lead. My name is Carlos Vargas. As and every week, I have here my two co-hosts, Paul Lewis and Howard Holton. Hey, guys.
Hey, Carlos. How are you this week?
Very good. And you? Hey,
Excellent.
Paul.
Excellent.
Hey there. Always good to see you.
And my friends, this week, we have the pleasure to have with us Guy Surev. He's a senior counsel, and I don't want to mess up his title because he's a legal counsel. So I'm going to let him go because I wanted to keep everything. I want to learn a lot. So make sure that you take your notepads and you take notes. So Guy, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Carlos. Nice to be here. I am senior counsel at Michael Best and Friedrich LLP in beautiful Broomfield, Colorado. I am a privacy and cybersecurity attorney primarily, focus on helping clients out with all range of issues from governance issues to policies to compliance and all of the fun questions that come up around data from a legal perspective and also from a practical perspective. I've got quite a bit of history within enterprises. At one point in my life, I was data protection officer for CenturyLink and overviewing what we did from a European data perspective, and that's just expanded now. Happy to be here, and as I must do anytime I do one of these, anything that I say is not legal advice. If you do have any questions, please consult your attorney. Thanks, Carlos.
I just consult Howard. Let's see. He gives me all the legal advice I require.
I think the answer to every question is always just ask Howard.
That's right.
Which is why Paul is currently filming from the Canada Federal Detention Facility.
That's right. It hasn't been successful, but it's been advice.
Right. I'm happy to give advice. I don't necessarily give good advice.
Right.
So on that note, you're kind of a new guest, right? Most of our guests have been C-level leaders inside a company, either CEOs or CIOs, CTOs, that sort of thing. But I thought with kind of COVID and some of the decisions that we're making as organizations and as IT leaders, it was worth bringing someone with your expertise in just to kind of chat about what you're seeing. Right? Not to give legal advice, obviously, but rather just kind of comment on some of the practices that you're seeing, maybe some of the changes in the market, in the environment, and just kind of take a minute to give some best practices. And those can be either, anything from, hey, be aware that this is coming, to, hey, I've seen a lot of this decision made to enable work from home, and this is the cleanup that I would recommend. Right? Or this is the risk in these type of decisions that we've seen, and maybe don't do that.
Yeah, there's a lot of don't do that's that have popped up. Starting from the very beginning of all of this, right? The pandemic drove so much work to be done remotely, and so we did see a lot of clients and a lot of just industry practices of how do we rationalize around and how do we operationalize a workforce that's largely been within four walls that we contain using hardware that we control. And I think the big issues that are popping up and are going to continue to pop up is how consistent was the deployment of the work from home strategy? How consistently were your employees using whatever environment you created? Because the issue that I see is going to arise as we return to work is how much work product was generated on a PC that wasn't connected to a VPN or a VDI? How many file shares were used? Were employees utilizing Dropbox? Were they utilizing Google Cloud? How much of this do you know? And so the resulting issue is, how much proliferation of data are we going to see? And I think that's one of the big things to try to get a grip on now is getting control of any of that data that may have leaked outside. Does create some compliance issues. And Some issues that kind of are starting to pop up and will continue to pop up is the privacy issues, right? We've got California, they've got the new privacy law tomorrow, July 1st is the enforcement date. There is some potential that there was some processing that was going on that is not in bad faith. It's still consistent with the business practices, but IT looking at what is being done to the extent that they have a part in the overall privacy, compliance, and governance structure, IT needs to get an understanding of what was done with that data. Did that data show up in some places that either we need to rectify now or we need to account for in our privacy policies, in our overall governance documents to ensure that we have captured that processing activity?
So one of the things that I see being kind of missed, somewhat, because it's all hands on deck, focused on keeping the business working, right? Is a lot of the compliance requirements are companies must have a policy for insert policy purpose and must audit to said policy, right? They don't necessarily specify what has to be contained in the policy or how you have to do it. But basically, I have to have a policy for privacy. I have to have a policy for clean desk. I have to have a policy for PII handling. And then I have to audit against that. Would you say it's a relatively high recommendation that now would be a really good time to review those policies and update them to reflect what's going on right now?
Very simple answer, yes. It's a fantastic time to be focusing on policies. This is a really good time to be looking at what are you doing as a business, right? We've broken the model. We're not just relying on in-office computer systems. So we do know that some of our policies are now going to be out of date or need to be updated, not just to address what's gone on in the pandemic, but there's further issues that start to arise with this, right? How many companies have we seen out on the West Coast and moving eastward that we're probably going to go to a largely remote workforce in several sectors? So how well are your policies adjusted for that? I mean, yes, it came out of the pandemic, but there are certain areas, businesses and industries that have realized we can do this from home. We can save money on rent. We can save money on utilities. But the policies, the clean desk policy, that doesn't really address what does your desk at home look like. Mine is a mess as usual, but that's mostly because of a 3-year-old. But with that in mind, how many visitors come in and out of your house? We don't have, the controlled environment that we do for others. So does your clean desk policy address what does your desk need to look like at home? Question is, how do you audit against that? And there's going to be some creativity, and there's going to be some things that we need to do. I know I've seen a lot of recommendations out there. Stop printing things. I think it's a good recommendation, not just from a security standpoint. It's just one, it's a cost savings, it's an environmental issue, but it starts to reduce, and it makes issues like this naturally get resolved because you don't have to worry about the clean desk policy. But one of the policies that really should be focused on right now, if you don't already have one because you prohibit them, or you have a weak one, BYOD policies have got to be fixed. I mean, that's essentially what we're doing now, right? We are doing full-scale BYOD, unless you're a company that you provide every piece of hardware. And I'm talking not just the laptops and the cell phones. Are you providing the routers? Are you providing the entire network structure in somebody's house? I'm going to go ahead and guess no. So that's something that needs to be considered within the BYOD. If you are working from home, what does your BYOD policy say about router maintenance or about the level of security and antivirus that you have to have on every machine that touches that network? Because I do not live alone. I live with my wife and my daughter. They access the network, they're on. So those are things that we've got to consider as well, not just from a policy standpoint, but just from a practical, how do we make sure everything stayed secure and is something that we can audit against?
Well, doesn't policy and education go hand in hand? Like we've gone from tens of people working at home to tens of thousands of people in the same organization. And there's been the information workers, but now we have the task workers, right? The contact center people, and even the essential workers, right? Even like academics, 70-year-old professors at university are now working at home. So yeah, and I guess arguably the shift has dramatically moved from the office control to this federated environment where it's the Wild West out there. Anybody could have anything, and you're not duplicating the office, you're not duplicating the technology. At the very least, they might have laptops and VPNs or VDI, but that's kind of the least, right? That's right. So therefore, education now needs to be at the forefront. A whole bunch of people who've never worked at home, never touched technology before, never handled data before at home, now has to. Well, then what do we do with that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And this kind of is, this is just I know it's a news flash to everybody. Pre-pandemic, policies without education are completely meaningless. And if we're not also, while we're doing these policy updates, updating our training on just best practices, even just reasonable practices, if we're not doing that, then we're failing ourselves. Right? Because we can have the best policy in the world, but if nobody's been trained on it, I mean, I know Howard's a voracious reader. I read because I have to, and I get paid to do it.
I'm pretty sure he's reading right now in parallel to this.
Exactly. There's 5 documents on the side that I'm reading. No, it's not everybody does that, and not everybody has the same ability to read a very, very technical, very boring document. Let's be honest, policies are not fun. It's no prayer for Owen Meany. It is instead dry documents that give basic instructions, right? We need to have education, and you're not going to be able to customize an education for everyone that it hits, but the same education that you do every year on your InfoSec, why don't you also have, and you should also have, training for, now that we know we're going to be working from home a lot more, here's how you should work when you work at home. I don't really want to go to the degree of, and everybody in your house needs to watch this training, but I think a component of the education is at least something of, if you are not in your house by yourself, or wherever you happen to be working, these are the things that you should ask of those around you. And this, we've addressed this problem before, right? With the coffee shop problem. How much work should you be doing in a coffee shop? How much work should you be doing on an airplane? Well, it depends. What kind of work are you doing? And if it's just something on the screen, maybe you can do something to avoid that. But so much now is done. We've got Zoom calls, we've got conference calls. Things can be overheard. How do we address this? What do we do to prevent any sort of leakage that are otherwise addressed in a policy, but don't have that education component already? And I think the pandemic is a perfect learning lesson for that, right? That there are things that we thought we had addressed in our BCPs, right? We know that if this site goes down, we're switching everything over here. In large part, BCPs didn't address this type of issue, and so that's where, yes, it is keeping the business running, but a big component, Paul, to your point, is education is the only way that we make that happen. And that also helps, going back, Howard, with the issue you raised, that goes back to auditing, right? We can audit how much training someone was given. We can, that can be done. And so it at least gives us some sort of trail that we can work with.
So Howard, what do you think the trend is going to be? Do you think the trend from a CIO will be providing the entire office, rack, stack, and...
I think the trend has to be that. Like, What I actually think should happen. So every BYOD policy that I've seen is we don't provide the network.
Right.
End statement. Right. Use reasonable security on your network. End statement. It doesn't define those things, nor would a definition actually matter, because people who understand what that means are already doing it. Right. People who don't understand what that means, it wouldn't matter if you clearly defined it, because they don't know what it means. Right. And so I think the next step actually is we're now adding the network, but it's a separate network, as in you get a $15 WAP, which is what they sell for. I carry one when I travel to hotels, right? And if the hotel provides an Ethernet jack, I plug my WAP into their Ethernet jack so that I control the network at that point. And you can do exactly the same thing at home. Hey, here, it's a WAP, it's pre-configured, you plug it in, right? It's Wi-Fi 5, Wi-Fi 6, whatever current, technology they want to support. It's $15 to $25 cost to the business in low quantities, much less, I don't know what it would be in high quantities because I don't look at that. And this is the only network that you are allowed to be connected to. I think something like that is a good start. It avoids we own the whole network. It avoids we can't audit the home network, right? But it still provides, you can have automated VPN tunneling configured on it already. So you don't have to worry about the endpoints VPN being up or down or breaking. It allows you to do a lot better reporting because the device is always on. So the VPN tunnel is always connected and you can see, do we have a problem with that? It gives you some sort of network QoS that you can track. I think there's a lot of value to something like that. But I would also like to comment that I think a good first step is to take a look at your policies and not only update them, but also go, while these were probably written by legal and probably written kind of for legal, they really shouldn't have been. They should have been written by someone who speaks English, approved by someone who speaks legal, for someone who speaks English, right? Because I'm not wrong, but to your point, you're not wrong, right? But to your point, these are dry documents. These are long documents and they're dry documents, but they're not actually designed to be. They're designed to be policies followed by your employees and thus should be written in a way that your employees can read and maybe can kind of get to the nuts and bolts of relatively quickly to know what they're actually supposed to do.
Yeah, and from two things I want to hit there. From a legal point, I think the WAP is perfect, right? From a legal perspective, it makes me a lot more comfortable because I'm not concerned about now the company being able to capture everything that I do on my network, right? And that's where if you are trying to take it from the outside in network approach, there's too much bleed over, and frankly, as a company, you don't want that level of information. It's just, yes, information is gold, but not some of it is pyrite, right? That kind of stuff you really don't want in your system. It leads to too many issues. As for the policies, I will say the clients that I like to work with the best are where I'm not drafting the policy by myself or in a silo or anything else like that, where it's really a collaborative work with IT. And frankly, if it comes to me from IT or InfoSec or Ops, and it just needs to be translated into the proper, well, we've got to say it this way, it turns out better, and the end product and the results are better, right? Because now it's not written in legalese. And I don't take offense to the fact that lawyers don't speak English. Not really. We have a way of thinking and writing and talking, and I appreciate that it doesn't always come through. And so while it's a little bit said in jest, it really is important now, right? That even more people are going to be needing to read these policies, be exposed to the policies, be exposed to the training associated with it. Now more than ever, we've got to make sure that these things can be understood by every level of the business and not just one department or another.
And you absolutely have your own language. I have Black's Law Dictionary sitting on my bookshelf, any group of professionals that has their own dictionary speaks a different language. Like you can't even deny it.
No.
People are far more aware of the agreements they click on now, right? They might not read all the T's and C's, but they're far more aware that they're agreeing to things, and they may not understand the things that they agree to. There's a risk there, potentially even a reputational risk if you just let people slide.
Well, yeah. I mean, go ahead, Howard.
So you brought up an interesting thing that I don't want to lose the train on, because and that when you were talking about clean desk policy and what does your office look like and what do the conversations look like, I haven't seen a lot of I don't know, conference call policy, but it's almost time for a video chat policy. Like, it was one thing when we were all in the office and we met in the office and we could kind of talk, like there were things we wouldn't write on the whiteboard, as an example, right? There were some terrible changes that came down post HIPAA that made a lot of the fun we had not so much fun anymore when I worked in healthcare. But like within the context, within the confines of our own building, of our own space, we can have a very different conversation than we can have when one or more people are on a conference call on a speakerphone.
Yeah.
Right. And I would say there's a big difference between I have a headset and I'm at a coffee shop versus I'm on a speakerphone in a car by myself. I'm on a speakerphone in my house by myself. And I'm on a speakerphone when there's ever anyone else present for any reason. Right. Even if it's a 3-year-old child playing Switch in the other corner of your office. And I really don't know that I've ever seen a Zoom policy, a conference policy. And especially with a full work from home environment, I keep trying to use that acronym and it just doesn't fit for me. WFH, like, but with a full work from home environment, I almost think that's a policy that we really should have and put some serious thought into. Like, if privacy, personally identifiable information cannot be shared, we probably should remove those things from conference calls.
Especially the distinct difference between like a public Zoom and a private Teams, right? They look and feel the exact same, but they are very different technologies with a very different openness standard to them.
But I can't present even at Teams, right? I can't present at Teams and know that the person's spouse on the call sitting in their home office doesn't actually have someone that they live with that doesn't work for a competitor.
True.
Right? And that's just competitive language. But what if it's, I work for a healthcare provider and we're discussing something that might trail into PII, right? What if we're discussing a defect we've found within our modality system that might apply to patients? What if we're discussing things that by their very nature contain risk? These are discussions that probably need to happen, but I would say we also need to develop a policy and ensure that everybody's aware of these are things that can no longer happen on general chat.
Yeah, and telemedicine is a perfect example, right, of this. And that, what policies, what procedures do we have in place where you've got a consultation between a physician and their patient? What policies does whoever the physician is working for, whether it's a hospital, a private practice, or the like, have they addressed this? So yeah, I think and I don't see this going away, right? We are creatures that latch on to new things, to do things in easier and more efficient way really quickly. And I don't see the video conference going away anytime soon, right? We're either because we are reducing our footprint within offices, or we're not traveling as much anymore, either for safety or for cost. All of these things, this is going to be the way that we do things, right? And the video conferencing, that one I think is not just a work from home issue. That becomes an issue when we do return to work, right? Because we're going to be doing these more often. And employees and the rest of the workforce is going to want to do these things. This is an easier way to get things done. Well, what do? Our policies permit the use of cameras within the facility, And if they do, are there limitations where those cameras can be deployed? That's going to be the case in a lot of facilities. So again, back to policies. Policies are going to need to be adjusted, and this is going to be one that I think the conference calling, it's going to have to harmonize with a lot of pieces to this. But there's going to be a lot of good groundwork already done, right? Whiteboard policies. What can be written on the whiteboard? What needs to be erased? I don't care who it is. I don't care what it is. You can never write this on a whiteboard. Those kind of things can be ported. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be creating anything from complete scratch. I think it's going to be building, and that'll help too, right? Because that helps with buy-in. That helps with keeping within your company voice, unless, to Howard's point, it's written in legalese and it needs to be translated. When you do that, we're still building off of pre-pandemic groundwork. Because one of the things that I am concerned about is that there is a rush we've got to address everything pandemic perspective. And then we're left, in a couple months, hopefully, when all this is, a little bit better under control. Now we've got, the world is on fire policies. We don't need those. That's not going to be, it's not going to be useful. And it's going to create those compliance issues that we started the conversation with, right? If we've painted ourselves into this corner, do we really need to have the strict strict policies that we put in place for a pandemic? So I think balancing those, building off the legwork, understanding the new world, and then just thinking creatively with how we need to address how employees consume technology and produce data and information.
So that brings up a legal concept that I love, so much so that I talk about it when I do my legal introduction to IT, right? Like I have a whole talk that's translating between legal and IT, and it's this concept of reasonability, right? What is reasonable for someone in a similar situation to do, think, say, or act upon? And I think a lot of companies miss that, especially when creating policies. And I'm going to use GDPR as an example, right? So the right to be forgotten. I think I would say most of our listeners have heard of the right to be forgotten, but just in case, it provides an EU resident the right to request that they be forgotten from a company's systems. And that response has to be processed and answered within a certain time frame. And it has to be answered with some detail as well as a matching summary that goes along with it. But it also never dies, right? But companies are constantly saying, well, I don't know how to do that because it gives us, we'll say 3 months. It gives us 3 months to respond. And I don't know how to get everything off of our backup tapes in that time. To which I respond, are you aware of reasonability? And I think when it comes to policy, I think the same thing really needs to be taken into consideration. Because if you don't take reasonability into consideration, you do paint yourself into a corner, right?
Yeah, if you don't take reasonability into it, I mean, what we're going to wind up with is everybody's going to have to, and I'm just going to pause, put a big disclaimer. I'm not advocating for this at all. This is not a recommendation, not guidance at all. We're going to wind up with everybody sitting in an isolated bunker to do work. And that's if we're not reasonable about our approach, right? We're not saying you have to kick your entire family out of the house when it's time to work, right? That goes to ridiculous extremes. But what is reasonable, right? And I think that's going to be tricky. And it's a great concept. It's a loaded concept too, because it's going to depend on nature of your industry. What's a standard best practice? I mean, what's everybody else doing? I mean, that to bring GDPR up, I mean, it was how a lot of companies have and continue to comply with GDPR is follow the herd, right? See what everybody else is doing and follow along. The problem is that at some point somebody has to step out and be the trailblazer. And so if that is you, if you are the trailblazer, for the sake of all the rest of us, be reasonable with what you want to do. I mean, It's make it so that, because the flip side to that is, if you're so unreasonable, you make compliance impossible. Well, if you're making compliance impossible, that ultimately means you're making work impossible. And at the end of the day, that's the important thing, right? That the wheels keep turning, the business keeps going. And so as we emerge, hopefully post-pandemic, though I saw that there is another potential pandemic on the rise in swines again. This is a good time to be taking that look at, all right, what do we really need to do to actually be defending? And for that, if there happen to be any attorneys on the phone, anybody from legal departments, I beg of you, work with the IT teams, work with the InfoSec teams, learn what the absolute boundaries are, what is possible, and then work inside that boundary. It helps. It helps a lot because, one, it's been my experience. I can only speak for myself, but it develops a level of trust and understanding between both, so that instead of legal getting the call at 11:30 at night saying we have a problem, you knew about the things that could give rise to the problem a day before. You don't have to get out of bed. That, because you're not getting that call. And on the IT side, I mean, I'll let Howard and Paul talk to this, but my impression has always been that when legal comes and says, we're here to work with you, learn what your boundaries are, learn what the limitations of our technology are, that there tends to be a bit more forthcoming. It's not neither side is saying we have to do it this way. This has got to be a collaborative approach. And if pandemic has taught us anything, it's taught us that collaborating across teams, across offices, across geographic areas is possible, and it actually works well.
And there's a long tail to it. I'm glad you brought up GDPR, because there's a current pushback from U.S. government to sort of the EU about the implementations and implications of GDPR with cyber criminals in COVID sense. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, what's the pushback? What's the concern? Are we really protecting criminal activity with this regulatory body?
I'm not digging too deep into that one just yet, and for a wide host of reasons.
Well, don't give an opinion. Just give me an appreciation for what the concern is.
I think there is, there is some level of concern about how much of cyber criminal, how much protection there is for that. But at the same time, there is, since the beginning of GDPR, this is the continuing tug of war, right? Which country really, which region really gets to dictate, what information is coming across? Because what may be, and I think a level of concern is, what may be considered to be a cyber criminal, it's really not, right? Is this more information gathering for another purpose? And so we'll see. There continues to be some movement in Europe, and some interesting things coming out with GDPR. One of them, it was a year, 18 months ago or so, where, how do you bring up the right to be forgotten? There was a clarification on that it's a right to be forgotten in the EU. And so extraterritoriality and being able to enforce laws that are primarily within one country outside of that country or that economic region, it's going to be a continuing question, right? And there too, I mean, just my own thoughts and impressions. Everybody wants to be the one that catches the bad guy, right? Because when you're the one that catches the bad guy, you get a lot more control and get to dictate a lot more things of what happens, and what do we do next.
Well, and I think the concern that Paul's asking about, based on what I've seen, is a little bit not understanding how GDPR is executed, right? Because I think some of the concern is that someone can submit a right to be forgotten based on an IP address, because they've tried to be nefarious or have been successfully nefarious, and then they think they can go back and submit a right to be forgotten for this IP address. And And while I think technically that's possible, part of right to be forgotten is I actually have to look for all of that information. I have to dig in and find that information to be able to forget it. And the reality of the situation is, while people who don't understand technology can very easily say that's now a thing that can be done, the reality of the situation is criminals don't often come back to a house, knock on the door, and go, "Hey, so I was here the other night, and I think I left some fingerprints, but I'm going to execute my right to be forgotten and erase those fingerprints. Do you mind if I come in and poke around for a bit?" Like, the act of submitting the request raises the red flag, right? And you kind of go, this isn't a customer. This isn't someone that we've actively marketed to. Like, we now see them in places that we shouldn't see that information. We kind of have raised a red flag. So I don't know that the reality is it enables what our Congress people and government seem to think it does.
But isn't the other side too, where one could be protected by the shield of GDPR, so that my private information, my transactions that have occurred in EU can't actually be exposed to the powers that be in the United States, and therefore we're potentially covering up criminal activity because I have to use public sources like Whois to find out if this person is somebody I care about.
I don't think so. Like, Guy, you're welcome to correct me, but it seems like an international warrant is an international warrant, and if it's really worth putting that much effort forth, like, you're going to get Interpol involved, you're going to get criminal investigation organizations involved. That I don't see GDPR being an effective shield to those things.
Yeah, well, and even just at its base level, I tend to agree with you there. Though, I mean, you never know the way the courts are going to go, and I'm not aware of any of these issues coming up. But because you can submit the request, right? But just submitting the request, it's not unequivocal, right? Let's do a non-criminal example. I sign a commitment with you for a 1-year subscription to your music service, and my agreement with you says it cannot be canceled. There are no refunds. And I decide, you know what? I've got my fill a month in. I don't want this anymore. I want you to delete all of my information. Haha, I don't have to keep paying for the subscription that I paid for. No, we have exceptions within GDPR that says, you can keep the information. You can refuse it if you need it to perform a contract. There's some other lawful basis, and some of those lawful bases do extend to compliance with laws, defending yourself. Now there become restrictions on what you can do with that data. But it's not an unequivocal right that you can just say, delete my stuff, and there's no pushback, right? That would be, the enterprising thing there. It's not necessarily I've engaged in nefarious activity, but within a system that I'm trying to cover up, it's I reach out to Lexis and say, Lexis has a gigantic background check database. Right? I reach out to them and say, delete everything about me. Delete my entire criminal history. I'm not saying me, I'm saying the global me. That's the kind of stuff that where the right to be forgotten. And we see the same thing in the right to deletion in California with CCPA, right? That it gets misconstrued as these are not unequivocal rights that you just have to comply with. You have to delete everything. But what you do have to have is you have to have enough of an understanding of your data and enough of an understanding of what you are doing with that data to be able to make that determination. Do I need to delete this information, or is there something in our environment that says I need to keep it, but now I need to isolate it just for this?
Is it enough to be documented so that you've already? Is it enough to be documented so you've already predetermined as an organization that here are the limitations of deletion, limitations of right to be forgotten? That it's already been a list of things on what I will or will not do.
I think that's a huge part of privacy by design, which is a big one for GDPR. It's a big requirement. If the Washington privacy law, Washington State, if that privacy law goes forward in the form that it looks like it's going to go, that same concept will be there. I think that's a component of privacy by design, right? I have worked with a client in the past that this very topic came up. They wanted to just have a quick list of, these are the things that, I want to pre-populate my response when somebody sends in a deletion request. And I want to be able to say, we deleted this information because we don't need this information. We kept this information for these reasons. And then it was, if they got a request, it was form fills, right? They got a request. You see, we've got data about this person in these 8 databases. Great. I know exactly what my response is. It cuts down processing time immensely. Now, the issue is, do you have in place what you need to be able to do that? This particular client, it wasn't that complicated, right? It wasn't a complex system, large interrelated. I mean, we're talking maybe 20 or 30 systems total. If you are talking about 1,500 to 2,000 systems, seen those two, that starts to get tougher. But that also suggests, and Howard and I have talked about this multiple times, that's why data governance is so key for this privacy compliance, for the cybersecurity client compliance, because you could easily trim down your response time to deletion requests and have a much better idea of what it is you need to do if you do all this ahead of time. But it's easy to say that. It gets a lot more complex when you try to operationalize it.
So it's kind of funny, Paul, but it's effectively, we're right back to the EIM conversation. Enterprise information management is really, really, really hard and really, really, really important, and it's not getting less important, right? And so companies that have moved EIM to the back burner are the ones that are going to be in the most trouble with this, because while it's easy to say we have a contractual obligation to maintain this data, that really only works when I know where all the data is, right? It falls apart really quickly when I haven't executed on EIM. I don't have a complete data catalog. I don't have policies in place. Then it's like, well, these 3 locations I'm really well aware of and know what to do with. These 867,000 locations, I'm at a complete loss, right? And I think that's where things like, and maybe we should have a future episode on it, where things like data ops really start to have a play, right? So as you start to do these things, you start to involve them in a DevOps style data management program that allows you to kind of fulfill the needs of EIM, automate a lot of the requirements of governance, and at the same time, kind of reduce that risk and limit or mitigate that liability. It's my favorite thing to say about legal. And I think the walkaway that I like to give too is the job of legal is ultimately to mitigate risk, reduce risk, and mitigate liability, right? I mean, if we just distill it to one statement, we can get into nuance, and I understand having an attorney on the phone means nuance is where we live. But if we just really kind of try to narrow it down to one thing, but if we look at IT, in reality, that's kind of our job too. Sure, we use technology to enable the business, but the constant overlay to all of that is we do it in a way that reduces risk and mitigates liability, right? That's why we have cybersecurity. That's why we have policy. That's why we have all of these things. And I think when having a conversation between IT and legal, the best thing both parties can do is recognize that the other person's job is to do that, right? No one's job is to say no. And I think too often when IT interfaces with legal and legal interfaces with IT, the default both sides kind of come to the table with is no. The other party's going to say no. They don't understand my job. The other party's going to say no.
That both of us get paid by earning more revenue, right?
Right.
So we can say no all we want, but guess what?
Yeah.
Yeah. Ultimately, we all report to the CEO, whose job it is to increase the value of the company and earn more revenue. And so we're actually better off if we sit down and go, okay, you want to figure out how to comply with this legal requirement. I want to figure out how to enable the business. We both want to do it in a way that reduces risk and mitigates liability.
Right.
How do we come together and find some common language? And I think where the trouble actually exists is when IT talks legal and legal talks IT. Like legal, instead of saying this is the legal requirement, I want a system that accomplishes these goals. Legal says, I want you to do it this way using technology. You know what I mean? These are the technology requirements versus these are the legal requirements. I need a way to accomplish documenting these processes. I need a way to accomplish this outcome. Is a world of difference. Then IT can come back and go, oh yeah, we can easily do that these 4 ways. Which of these 4 ways do you want to dig into? Which of, how do you want to see these? Does this work? Does this fit policy? And then you have this real collaborative thing. But I think when we get out of our swim lanes, it starts to become dangerous.
So do we think that in the last 3 months, risk tolerance has turned down? That we're a little bit more okay being a little bit more agile, and therefore we don't need 30 people making decisions. Every policy isn't a good policy, those kind of things. Did we turn it down a notch? Not all the way, but did we go closer to agility versus closer to control?
I think it depends on your industry, right? I think in some, I think risk tolerance went down, right? Where you are in an industry that you've got a lot of information workers, but the information is not, it's not so critical, it's not so sensitive that, maybe everything that we were doing with those information workers, we can dial back, right? We're not making them sit in a particular room so that we can monitor everything that's going on. But then in others, think healthcare. Think about how much we now have to account for as more and more work in the medical community is done outside of the hospital, outside of the doctor's office, where there are controls in place and that need to be there. So I would say, if you've got an acronym law for your industry, I think you were a little less tolerant of risk now, right? If you're GLBA, you're HIPAA, you're FCRA, I think you got to worry a little bit more. If you're not, yeah, you probably were able to turn down. And that's where, we talked about the reasonableness. The reasonableness and the reasonable standard is not always what would everybody do. It's what would everybody like me do. And so that's where I think we don't have an answer one way or the other. But at the end of the day, what I do think is that everybody should be updating policies to address this. This isn't going to be the last time we do this, either because of a pandemic or because we've just seen a culture shift. We got to address for those compliance issues, got to address for the accountability. And look, we're all working together, maybe even better now. So I think those are the good things to do and the good things to take away.
Well, it's been an awesome conversation, Guy and Paul and Howard. So my friends, I don't think that there's anything else to add. It's been awesome to have you here with us today, Guy. And to each one of you that are listening or watching, make sure that you subscribe and share this video or audio podcast with your team and your family members. Because remember, we want to continue to grow to be better leaders. And in this time and in any time, learning from others is a great way to do it. So my friends, we'll see you on our next episode.